We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make CapTime's Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Epic. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Hello again. Welcome to our afternoon session, the first afternoon session. I'm Paul Fanlin, editor and publisher of the Cap Times. David Maraniss has long been interested in the intersection of sports, race, and social justice, and it's reflected in his wonderful books about baseball star Roberto Clemente and his upcoming book about Olympic gold medalist Jim Thorpe, which is due out next year. For this session, David has invited an incredible national panel to explore that topic. He'll be joined by Howard Bryant, who's a senior writer with ESPN, who has been sports correspondent for NPR's Weekend and is author of 9 books, including 2 that won the Casey Award as the best baseball book of the year. One was about Henry Aaron, and the other was about race and baseball in Boston. Also on the panel is David Zirin, sports correspondent for The Nation magazine, the author of 11 books, most recently one titled The Kaepernick Effect. Colin Kaepernick, of course, was the former National Football League quarterback whose career ended over controversy stemming from his taking a knee during the national anthem. David hosts the popular podcast The Edge of Sports and is a columnist for The Progressive. They'll be joined by Toni Smith-Thompson, who drew attention in 2003 over her protests as a basketball player at Manhattan College. It was national news when she repeatedly turned away from the American flag during the anthem. She is regarded by many as Kaepernick before Kaepernick and is now a senior organizer with the New York ACLU. The 2 Davids are here in person. Howard and Toni will join them on screen, and please welcome them to our stage. Thank you.
I come bearing gifts. We have 8 copies of Dave Zirin's fabulous new book, The Kaepernick Effect, and 2 of Howard Bryant's brilliant set of essays, Full Dissidence, which has been called an oracle, and I agree completely with that. I wrote Howard and said I thought it had touches of James Baldwin and George Orwell in it, and I meant it. It was really quite something. So, you know, this subject is close to my heart, and I'm thrilled to have these 3 wonderful people with me up here. Sports and social justice was ingrained in me deeply by my father, who taught me never to root for the Boston Red Sox because they were the last team to have black ball players. Of course, the way baseball's going now, I might not be able to root for any team at some point in terms of the number of African Americans in that sport. I hope that turns around. So Paul introduced the 3 of them. I know Dave and I know Howard and love their writings, and both of them. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Toni Smith-Thompson in person, but her story is incredible, and I think that in a way the writings of David and Howard converge in the Toni Smith-Thompson story. So Toni, why don't we start with you and tell us about that moment in 2002 and 2003 and what you did and what led you to that point of dealing with the national anthem in a different way.
Sure. Hi, and it's nice to almost meet you in person. I'm seeing myself double, which is a very interesting experience. So in 2002, 2003, I was a senior at Manhattanville College in Westchester, New York. It's about 30 minutes outside of New York City. I was a sociology major and was about a year into courses in sociology, right? So the prison industrial complex, gender studies, all of the kind of intro to sociology, capitalism, Karl Marx. But we were also in the immediate post 9/11 period then, and so we just hit the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This was when I started protesting was December in 2002, and so we were really a year out from 9/11. There had already been a year's worth of dissent demanding not to go to war, and we were leading up to invading Iraq. So there was really like a bubbling up of anti-war movement activity. And that was the first time that I distinguished that the playing of the national anthem before athletic events was not a benign activity. And I had participated in it the first 3 years I was playing college basketball, and suddenly it took on new meaning, and it really began to feel really, really dangerous, really toxic. You saw the sort of white nationalism growing, the suppression of dissent growing, the expectation that everyone needs to conform, and so this was just my way of sort of exploring or expressing my own growth as a little baby growing activist at that point. This was one of the first things that I identified for myself that I could do that would be meaningful and in line with my values. I had been attending protests in and around New York City, up in the Albany area, protesting the Rockefeller drug laws, calling for those to be repealed. Those were drug laws that imposed mandatory minimum sentencing. And so that was very much my world then, and this was just a small thing that I thought I could do to demonstrate that one person could identify something and do it, even though it was scary, and it was scary.
So what literally did you do, Toni, and what was the reaction?
So I literally just turned the other way during the playing of the national anthem. And a lot of people ask how I decided to do that. And that was actually one of my favorite parts of reading The Kaepernick Effect, was some of the young people interviewed talking about how they decided how exactly they were going to protest. Am I going to sit down on the bench? Am I going to go into the locker room? Am I going to take a knee? And I actually played all of those scenarios in my head, not taking a knee, but sitting on the bench, kind of going into the locker room, and actually just turning the other way seemed like the least, the way that would be least upsetting to people and the most fulfilling for me, because I wouldn't have to actually remove myself from my team in order to protest. So I turned the other way, national anthem played. No one said anything to me for quite a number of games. So from December to late January, no one said anything. And then late January going into February, there were, that's when sort of the team dynamics got really dicey. Team members were upset with me. And then going into February was when it became a national news story. Middle of February of 2003.
Right. And here we are almost 20 years later, and we're still dealing with the same issues, maybe forever. I hope not. Dave, this book is an incredible document of the way that Kaepernick and Toni and really going back to Howard's book, The Heritage, this long history of social protest. But what specifically was the inspiration for doing this book, and what were your expectations going into it?
Wow. Well, first of all, an honor to be here. An honor to be in Madison with your cheese and beer-based economy. I have looked forward to supporting that for a long time. And an honor to be here with you, David. Thank you so much for having me here. Well, for me, the idea of this book, it really started right before the pandemic, I was having a discussion with 1968 Olympian John Carlos, who famously raised his fist on the medal stand. And John and I were talking, and he made a very offhand comment to me that after raising his fist during the national anthem in 1968, he just said to me in a very offhand way, he said, boy, people were doing that left and right at high school track meets after that. And that immediately set all my reporting senses going up. I was like, well, who did that? Who were these people? There were, apparently tons of Toni Smiths in 1968. Toni Smith-Thompson in 1968. And it's like, who were these folks? How did it affect their lives? And of course, this is 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago at the time. And so there didn't seem to be a way to actually track those folks down in a meaningful way. But it did get me thinking about all the one-off stories that I'd read since 2016 of this high school over here, or this college over there, or this middle school even, of people taking a knee, let alone the one-off stories about people like Megan Rapinoe, the soccer star, Eric Reed, Kenny Stills, even a woman who I remembered, but I didn't remember her name. I eventually did track her down. Her name is Leah Tice, who sang the national anthem in an NBA game and took a knee. Right in the middle of it, and interviewed her for the book. And and I was like, we need to document this, or else it's going to get memory hold. It's going to be forgotten. And we live in a celebrity culture. We live in a culture that focuses on the individual, particularly in periods of social movements and social protest. It's why we know the story of Dr. Martin Luther King, but not the story of the thousands upon thousands of grassroots civil rights activists during the Black freedom struggle. And I didn't want this era to be remembered for Colin Kaepernick, because it's not just about Colin Kaepernick. It's about the Kaepernick effect. And so I went and just started talking to young people. I put out queries online. I looked up old newspaper articles and found people on Facebook and Instagram. And at this point, the pandemic is starting, and all these young people are at home with nothing to do. And so I was actually able to get them on the phone and have long conversations with them, which is pretty rare for teenagers. For anybody who has a teenager, usually like my teenage son and daughter, they don't want a phone call from me unless I'm trapped under a sofa or something. It has to be like a text message, or else it's a family emergency. So, but I was in this unique circumstance where people actually did want to talk. So I just started recording all these stories. And that seemed like reason enough for a book, but then that changed dramatically in the summer of 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd, because then you have literally the largest protests in the history of the United States. And I don't think we say that enough in thinking about last year. So I went back and spoke to a lot of the people I'd interviewed, and they were all out in the streets. They were all organizers. They were all people who were doing something that summer, even in the midst of the pandemic. And it made me realize that while many roads may have led us to the summer of 2020 in this country, one of those roads ran straight through the playing fields of the United States, and I wanted to tell that story.
And you did wonderfully. Howard, I love all of your writing, but the first chapter in Full Dissidence is titled What Colin Kaepernick Taught Us. And what I thought I would do is sort of lay out the different things that he taught us from your essay, and have each of the three of you sort of respond to each one of those. It's so forceful and provocative, like everything you write, but the first line in that goes directly to what people in Wisconsin have been dealing with for the last 10 years. The line is, hating labor and labor unions is America's unofficial pastime. Act 10 certainly dealt with that here, but let's go through that list. The first thing you say, and Toni and Dave, you chime in on each one of these. You say, Cap taught us who is boss. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by it, and obviously, David, I wish we were doing this in person. I don't know if you can see over my left shoulder, but there is the David Halberstam, David Maraniss shelf on the bottom. You haven't seen each other for a while, so I'm really disappointed that we're not able to do this in person. Obviously, I see Dave a little bit more often. I really felt like that entire chapter was about taking a step back and recognizing something Dave just mentioned about being in this celebrity culture, and that we're placing so much of this on Colin Kaepernick, so much of this movement on Colin Kaepernick. And then I began to take a step back and think, well, wait a minute. If you really look at what's been happening here, the ball players were following. They weren't leading here. They were following. We were placing their celebrity at the forefront. But what was really happening is it was happening in the street a long time ago. So what I first meant was to really focus in on just how deeply this country is anti-labor. That just the very question of standing up for yourself at any level was going to force a reaction. And I wanted to concentrate on all of these different places in the culture that Kaepernick, that taking a knee may have highlighted, it may have exemplified, but the actual work is taking place by all of the same people that we considered anonymous that Dave was writing about in The Kaepernick Effect.
Toni, who's the boss?
I actually really appreciate what you said, Howard, because immediately, reading those lines in the book, obviously you think of labor and bosses, and you think of the tension between the workers and the capitalists. But actually then in your speaking about who was actually leading movements, that's a different kind of boss than I had considered before, that when you're talking about movements and you're talking about who's leading, then you talk about young people, right? It's young people leading. And as Dave, as you were speaking about your book, I was thinking about young people in that respect, and just how much they have been leading, right? And how much even though they were inspired by Colin Kaepernick's protest, many of those young people and more have been continuing the movement that Colin Kaepernick helped to grow in a way that I don't even know that Colin Kaepernick is deeply in at the moment. It looks like maybe his time is being occupied doing other things, but the young people are continuing on. And so I really like the duality of thinking about who's boss in that respect as well.
Yeah, I was going to jump in on that, Dave, and say as well that the reaction that people would have, and I'm sure you've heard it as well, well, I could never do that at my job, and I could never, and it was just, to me, it just kept, it reminded me of the teachers. It reminded me of the Supreme Court. It reminded me of all of these different things that are taking place where everything that even having a basic sense of, it's never going to be completely balanced. They pay us, right? We're working for somebody else. But does that mean that you have no say in anything? And that your institutions that you're paying your taxes to, Jane Merritt was talking earlier about the Supreme Court, that these institutions, they are telling you who's boss. They are completely aligned to crush you. And I wanted to really make sure that we didn't forget that this is not a passive activity taking place. This is an active activity. So when you see the unions and you see the teachers and you see, you see these class action suits coming up, that people are willing to take on a monstrous institution or combined institution that are really putting their foot down during this moment in time.
Yeah. And more, the point of protest is that it's not allowed. So yeah, it's true. You can't do that at your job. So do it, right? There are teachers across the country right now being told you can't teach the truth. And there are teachers across the country right now saying, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to teach it anyway because it's necessary and it's right.
Exactly. I mean, who knew that teaching about slavery would become an act of civil disobedience? But that's where we are in these United States. Yeah. And, this question of labor is part of the answer for why not just NFL franchise owners, but so much of the establishment freaked out when Colin Kaepernick took that knee. Colin Kaepernick took that knee, let's be clear, he did it because of police brutality and racial inequity. But the act of doing it, especially in an authoritarian, top-down, no contract guaranteed, your career only lasts 3.5 years league like the National Football League, that kind of statement of independence roiled things to a profound degree. I mean, and it's very connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, like this idea that the streets are roiling and then it gets reflected in this extremely conservative institution that is the NFL. And there's that old expression, that the Montgomery bus boycott was not done because people wanted better public transit. And it was done as part of something that created a degree of courage that was very contagious. And similarly, Colin takes that knee, and it has this contagion where other folks say, wait a minute, this is a language of protest. This is a method that I can adopt as a young athlete in a small town in Beaumont, Texas, to express my dissent about whether it's racism and police brutality or whether it's about just being treated like you're an unequal person in a society that treats you like you're nothing. And it's people's statement of existence in a way that I don't think Colin anticipated, and I don't think anybody who was originally talking about it anticipated. But I think people in this country are so desperate for a sense of justice that anytime you have an act of courage, it has that potential to be a spark.
Which leads to Howard's second point about what Cap taught us, which the caption might sound contradictory, but Howard, you can start it off on that. You said he taught us that black athletes are scared to death. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that was listening to Dave talk earlier when he was talking about these unknown people, whether it was talking to John Carlos in '68 or talking to these young students in 2020 during the pandemic, which is the idea what this movement has done is it undermines the cynicism. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that we heard constantly from black players who should know better was, you can't just take a knee. You got to be about real action. Or, Colin Kaepernick should keep his mouth shut. And then everybody was finding some way to come down on him. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at this and I'm thinking, we're giving these athletes all this credit for being courageous. There's very little courage here at all. That they're talking about things that are completely ahistorical. That protest doesn't do anything, and you got to be about the real action. And I'm listening to this, and all I could hear was fear. Mm-hmm. I could hear these athletes trying to be on both sides of the fence. They were trying to make sure when they went home, they had a little bit of street cred because black people have been waiting to hear from them since Tommy Smith and John Carlos and Muhammad. But at the same time, as soon as they got back into the clubhouses and the front office mates or their bosses would immediately tell them to say nothing, or they would remind them that their contracts weren't guaranteed, or that they were trying to straddle some imaginary line because they weren't really the ones who were all about it. The people who were all about it were the ones blocking traffic at LAX. Mm-hmm. They were the real people who were out there. And so I wanted to do a lot of parsing when you're listening to Dak Prescott and some of these other athletes, even athletes who you would consider to be sympathetic and allied with this would still say all kinds of nonsensical things like, you got to go do ride-alongs with the cops. I'm like, no, if you hop on CNN International, being in the street matters. You actually can just take a knee. You can do a lot of things without having some sort of concierge access to your local representative.
Toni, how did you experience that?
Well, in this culture, we are really pushed to accept that the pathway to success and power is through formalized structures of accumulating wealth and influence through that pathway, right? And so I think for people, take professional athletes who have a pathway at their reach to wealth and have a platform and power, is very seductive to say, this is the pathway, this is my best chance of amassing power. And I think we have largely been duped, right, to believing that is the more powerful pathway for people power. And, I think we've seen evidence of that certainly over the course of this country's history, but even in just recent years, this idea, Dave and I were going back and forth about this the other day, this idea that you can make change by playing chess, not checkers, right? That like every every move you make using power through formalized institutions is a move toward justice, is a move toward fighting for the masses of people, when actually it's probably more likely a move on the pathway toward individual empire, or it's a pathway toward being absorbed into the power class, into the capitalist class, and actually not a move toward being absorbed or being in solidarity with the masses of people.
Zirin, the modern man, working his cell phone while he's
I was
on a
trying to find Tony's
Are you
tweet.
really texting right now, Dave?
No, I was ferociously looking for the tweet that Tony sent because it said it so perfectly.
that.
Because I'm with you, Tony. If I hear one more person say, "Well, I'm playing three-dimensional chess," when all they're really doing is meeting with police chiefs or trying to own NFL teams, it's like, no, you're not doing anything except playing yourself.
Yep. And playing for yourself.
Exactly. It's like that also strikes me as hilarious when people say that somebody like Jay-Z, who looks like he's in line to buy the Denver Broncos, is that when people say he's selling out, it's like he's not selling out. The man's a billionaire. He's doing what billionaires do.
Catching in.
And it's like the problem is with us if we're looking for leadership from people who actually have very different interests than the people who are taking a knee in the streets.
the color of money.
And especially, in this moment where movements for racial and economic justice are actively under attack. There's always a hostility toward these movements, but in this moment, we are seeing very visible, very hostile, multifaceted attacks on these movements to take the steam out of them, right? And to violently suppress people who are participating in them. And one of the ways that these movements are attacked is by absorbing the people who have the biggest platforms and the most wealth into the power class, right? And have them believe and influence others that actually there's a compromise here that's possible, that actually inside baseball, having a seat at the table is enough, right? That making concessions will be better for us in the long run, and that has not panned out.
And it's constantly undermined by the truth. Because when you think about what actually got these institutions moving, it was people in the street. It was the guy taking a knee on the sideline. It was the people in Minneapolis doing their thing after George Floyd. It was New York. It was the image of having the Lincoln Memorial protected by the U.S. military, essentially having rifles in front of American citizens, in front of the symbol of United States liberty, right? I mean, it's all of the things. Every time you hear an athlete talk like this, you just pick up a book and say, you don't know what you're talking about. But it does tell you that they are on their way into that celebrity millionaire class. And David Maraniss, you and I talked about this on the phone the other day about making the distinction as journalists, making the distinction between activism and empire. Just because an athlete says something doesn't mean that this is activism. Very important distinctions.
Absolutely. Part 4 in Howard Bryant's essay on what Cap taught us how the NFL sees blackness. And I suppose in the answer we could expand the NFL to corporate America beyond the NFL.
There's something specific, though, about the NFL because of its reliance on black labor and the way that black labor has to effectively exploit itself in order to succeed, whether through the destruction of their own bodies and minds or their surrendering of basic rights. And I'm reminded of this discussion I got in with Brian Mitchell, who was a great NFL player and a big union guy. And Brian said to me, I was once asked by somebody, why do you make so much more than a cook? And I said, well, a cook cooks a steak. An NFL player is both the cook and the steak. And I was like, okay, that makes some sense. And it's also just a reminder of someone I did a book with named Michael Bennett, who played for the Seattle Seahawks. And Michael Bennett has said to me, and this will never leave me, he said, people think the NFL is integrated. It's not integrated. It is a segregated product because it's reliant on black labor for the benefit of almost entirely white ownership, not to mention executives and coaches. So actually it's the myth of integration that's being presented to the American public, and they write end racism in the end zones and all these post-2020 quote unquote reckonings that the league is supposedly going through. And yet it's much more an operation of carrot and stick, where they'll say these nice things, and Roger Goodell will say something like, gee, maybe Colin Kaepernick had a point in 2016, but the reality is as harsh as it's ever been for the black worker who's in the National Football League.
Yeah, and once again, these conversations are really not that different in any sport or in most businesses. And, David, you and I, we've talked about this over the years as well, is that our business is no different. You go back, whenever we're doing research on books, there are very few black voices writing about these black subjects because there are very few of us who had started to get jobs. I mean, one of my goals when I was a kid was to write for the Washington Post. That was the goal. That was the one thing I wanted to do with my career. And it was because of William Raspberry, the great columnist there. He was a syndicated columnist, so we got to read him up in Boston. And if you look at the percentages in media, it's not that different than the NFL. I say this, people talk about the NBA being an 80% black league. Sure, absolutely it is on the court. If you took the labor out of it, it's just as white as IBM or any other place. So when you look at these institutions, it's not just that they're conservative organizations, it's that they are segregated organizations. Even to the point where I know Wisconsin is big football state. But it is true. I ask myself this question all the time. It's not just the integration on the black side. It's the integration. It's the segregation on the slotting of it as well. That the leagues have decided. Are you really telling me that there is no white person on this planet of 7 billion people that can play cornerback in the NFL? There hasn't been a white cornerback in the National Football League since Jason Sehorn in 2008. I mean, they are deciding exactly who is going to play what position and why. And so I look at sports, whenever you look at sports, I say it all the time, white owners, white coaches, white media, white season ticket holder, black player. That's the filter through which so much of this is sent out to the public.
Toni, do you have anything to add to that, or you want to keep going?
I was wondering if I do. Yeah, but I guess I was just thinking about how your writing, Howard, has been a really good blueprint to look at other industries. And you talk about sports, and you talk about journalism and the slotting of people and the formula for who gets to be in which positions. And I think it's important for movement building that, as we're talking about economic justice and wealth inequality, that we focus much more on the labor owner relationship or labor boss relationship rather than focusing on which laborers make more money and how much more money as a way to as a way to separate and distinguish people. Because, as you write about, at the end of the day, NFL players are seen as the labor. That is the formula. And that's true across industries. That's true for how we recognize and celebrate all of these firsts, the first black person to do this, the first black person to do that, as though there was no one qualified all these years before, but really looking at it through the lens of who's holding the keys to the formula and when are those keys deciding to make an alteration.
Howard, you end your essay with the point of, finally, Cap taught us how exposed white America is. What did you mean by that?
David, I wrote that so long ago, I don't remember.
I'm asking at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember that last section really being, what I meant by exposed was this idea of us as a culture not being able to have it both ways. That there is a certain level of expectation that we have in these institutions. And what do we do? What do white people especially, what do you do when you recognize that this institution cannot satisfy you? It's not going to accommodate you. How do you have the right politics? How do you have the right values, the right viewpoints, and still realize that you're upholding these institutions, and that can you in good conscience, and to me obviously the answer is no, but can you in any good conscience maintain this structure? It's that lean in thing that we constantly talk about, that you can't have the ride along. How can you, the one thing about this, I think one of the areas that I was really trying to focus in on that section was for everything that we talk about when it comes to police reform, et cetera, there's not a single police unit in this country that is accommodating. This is a one-way ask. It's not a two-way partnership. It's a one-way ask. So how then does the white population who have the good values and think they're on the right side and believe in these things, how do you reconcile the complete and total resistance? It reminds me a lot of the end of that we caught in on what Jane Merritt was saying. How do you reconcile the active resistance that's taking place and maintain faith in those institutions? At some point, you have to say, I'm on the wrong side of this, but at what cost?
Yeah, and this
Now,
is,
I was going to say it's something that Black people have known all along, but Black people are also stuck because it's like, okay, we're 12.5% of the population. Where do we go with this?
I was going to say, this is so connected with the Kaepernick reaction, because when you drill down into the polls, tons of polls were taken after Colin Kaepernick took a knee, and it was like, do you support or do you not support him doing this? And the news would always say, well, clearly this is polarizing the country. And 2 points about that. First, and I've had to say this on like sports radio in the last week a lot, Colin Kaepernick didn't polarize the country. Police violence and racism has polarized the country. Like, to say that a reaction is what's polarized the country gets it all wrong. The second point is that when you drill down into the polls, it really wasn't America that was polarized by it. It was white America. Like, you looked at Black and brown folks, they were like, yeah, we support taking a knee against racism, by large numbers, 70, 80%. But when you looked at the white response, that's where you see where the debate and discussion and real friction really was. And it's that question that Howard just raised about looking at the society and saying, which side, in fact, am I on? And, I wrote this book in the spirit of optimism because I was like, wow, look at all these young people who took a chance and took a knee and, and tried to change their communities. But when I did a book discussion with Professor Eddie Glaude from Princeton, he said to me, there's a common thread in your book that you haven't said. And I said, what? And he said, in all these instances, there's the specter of violence for this peaceful act. It's like young people trying to act in accordance with peace, in accordance with the best traditions of struggle that they learn about in history class. Hopefully they'll learn about it in the future. And the response invariably was threats. It's the same thing that Toni was talking about with her experience, like this idea that you undergo this peaceful act to try to get people talking, and the response, instead of debate, discussion, or maybe we can disagree without being disagreeable, is, no, I am going to hurt you because you're making me think about things that I don't want to think about.
That's right. Well, I was going to say the other piece of that too, because we see how different we are as a culture, is one of the pieces. I don't want to embarrass you, David, but one of the inspirations for part of that section in that book in general was They Marched into Sunlight, all about Madison and about the student movement there, the way you blended what was happening in Vietnam and what was happening in Madison, because this is that moment. This is that full dissidence moment that people had in 1968 and 1969, where it was like, well, wait a minute, we now realize that we're the target. And that is not an attitude that many Americans have felt for a very long time, obviously because there's no draft anymore. So that has changed everything. But when you go back and think about the different moments in our culture, when you had those numbers and you had people make that choice, when they had to realize, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was. Now you see action. And I think that the thing that's been really interesting about this period is white America. I tell my son this all the time. I said, I want you to be as active as you need to be and to do the things that you feel you need to do. But remember, at its core, this conversation is white people talking to other white people. This is not really about you. You haven't asked for anything that is unrealistic. You haven't asked for anything at all, to be honest. But you see the hostility against, and pay attention to that. And make sure you're aware of your surroundings, of the real battles that are taking place. They're not really talking to you. They're talking to each other.
Yeah, even though they're often talking through you, through us.
Yes.
Right? Filtering their position through Black people. So I'm a white moderate. I need you, Black person, to know that. I'm a white leftist. I need you, Black person, to know that, right? I'm a far right racist. I need you, Black person, to know that. And I was thinking about, Dave, your book, and something that I identified resonance with my own protest and reading the stories of these young people is it seemed like many of them through their protest had their moment of parsing out their local white community, right? Mm-hmm. You've got the people who are openly hostile, threatening. There are the people who were trying to be neutral and maybe not so supportive, but also not being an accomplice or an ally. And then there are people who will come up to you later quietly and be like, I really admire what you're doing, mm-hmm. right? and so that you're like, well, can you say that out loud so I'm not by myself? And that's really hard. I remember that being really hard to navigate as an early experience, like 20 years out from it. You can navigate better. You've learned how to navigate. You experience how to navigate. You know kind of the impact of people coming up to you quietly and saying, I support you. You know that they're not going to say it publicly. You don't come to expect that. But as a young person just coming into your own, you have to figure that out. You have to figure out who is willing to play which roles. What is the extent to which kind of white moderates in your immediate circle are going to be helpful or harmful? What are the conversations that white people are having with each other about your protest, about your activism? And you have to navigate all of that in addition to being Black in this country.
Mm. I've always been fascinated, since Howard brought up Vietnam in a sense, by the symbiotic relationship between sports and the military. Mm. And I know all of you have as well. It goes in so many directions, even the terms, the military terms that are used in football, the blitz and not even understanding the Nazi derivations of the Blitz, and bombing London. And the other side, with Nixon using, his bombing of Hanoi as Operation Linebacker, right? I mean, but it's also in a more profound sense, of the vision of patriotism and the national anthem, which Toni dealt with and which the Cap dealt with, and the flyovers and the corruption of the NFL being paid by the Army. I mean, all of that is so intertwined and in a sense, corrupting the notions of patriotism through sports.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, David, not to interrupt, I don't know if you can hear me or not. Are you still there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay, okay. My screen froze for a split second, and I was worried. No, so it also tells you, David, how important sports is. It tells you they're not fighting over this playing field for nothing. They know the reach. They know. I remember talking to General Russell Honore about this, and I remember talking about this the other day when I said to him, well, with all due respect, General, I really don't know if I want my 12-year-old being targeted while he's watching a football game. And he said, well, that's too bad. Because I tell parents all the time to hold on to them little ones as long as they can. Enrollments are down. We need soldiers. And if there's some 12 or 13-year-old who's watching a Dallas Cowboys game and sees an F-14 fly over, and that motivates them to want to serve their country, then we're all for it. We can't get this kind of reach. We can't, as an institution, professional sports is an enormous, enormous carrot for us to make sure that, the general referred to it as looking for the warrior athlete, because when you're watching a football game, you're watching a Big Ten game, it's Wisconsin, against Indiana, or Wisconsin against Iowa, or whomever. So we've got our colors, we've got our opposition, we know the stakes. And so these things translate very well to the military, especially football. And David, you're very, very right about the terminology as well. And so all of these different things, it's not, people keep saying, well, pull your politics out of sports. Can't we just go back to it being a game? It was never a game. And it certainly is to the institutions out there that know the importance of sports. They know that you can't get this kind of advertising anywhere else.
Dave, what did you find about sort of the way that CAP's detractors tried to make this a question of patriotism as opposed to social justice?
Yeah, I found that was something that was replicated with so many of the experiences of young people whether they were in Beaumont, Texas, or Seattle, Washington. I mean, it really transcended whether they were in what we would think of as a big liberal city or a very, very rural, very red part of Georgia or Florida, because I spoke to folks from all over the country, and that common thread of this effort to try to openly distort what they were trying to say so the discussion about racism and police violence would not be had was a big common thread in the discussions. And it's, this is something that has a long history in this country, and this is why the heritage, that a book by Howard Bryant, is so important, because it holds out that question of, if you are black and you are protesting and you are challenging the police, are you even really a citizen? Are you even really an American? Are you even somebody who has the right, therefore, to speak and say anything? And that is such an old trope in this country. And to see it revive and resurrect like this horrific hydra that every time you think the head is cut off of that trope, it comes roaring back. I mean, it shows you about the price of protest. I was telling David in the green room just the incredible emotional experience I have reading David's book, Good American Family, about his own life, and to think about the people, David, who at the House of Un-American Activities Committee, who sat in judgment of your father and of basically his right to see himself as an American when they themselves had taken part in lynchings. Mm-hmm. I mean,
and sat in judgment of Paul Robeson.
And Paul Robeson, of course, yeah.
100%.
It's something that's very ingrained, I would argue, on the right, particularly on the white nationalist right of this country. And it was something that was immediately turned on to Colin Kaepernick and anybody who wanted to replicate what he was trying to do, to start these kinds of uncomfortable discussions.
And turned on to you probably too, Toni, right? In terms of making it look like you were challenging patriotism as opposed to what you were really trying to talk about?
Is that directed at me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, it was a little hard to hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's my fault. Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, I can hear now.
Okay. I said, I presume that it was turned on you as well, the notion that you were being unpatriotic as opposed to what you were really trying to talk about.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, and of course that's really not the issue. And we know that. We know that these are just distractions, and there's always going to be a new way to discredit Black folks or invalidate our belonging in this country and our ability to participate in it, right? Whether it's kind of literacy test to vote, whether it's criminalization, whether we're patriotic enough. I mean, it's all a ruse. What I often say to people when asked about this in the Kaepernick context is, if Colin Kaepernick had taken a knee and people had gone up to him and said, "Hey, why are you doing this?" and he had said something like, "I just want to show respect for all the brothers and sisters lost on the battlefield," we wouldn't even be having this conversation. It would have been a non-issue. It would never become a story. It would have been, if anything, it would have been, oh, he's so, he's so honorable, he's so patriotic. So it's really not about the tactic. We know it's not about the tactic. It's about the who. It's about the who, and it's about upholding American empire.
Dave, you wrote a piece for The Progressive, the great Madison magazine, called "Speak Out and Play." And you talked about sort of a revanchist effort of the shut up and dribble.
Yeah, I think this is just looking forward. What we're dealing with in 2021 is this reassertion of authority, not just in the world of sports, but in our society. I mean, I'll connect what's happening in the world of sports to the attack on teachers for trying to teach about racism. These are not dissimilar dynamics of this effort to try to reassert who is in charge and who is not in our society. You see it in the Supreme Court, and you see it in the world of sports. And it's something that we have to keep a very, very close eye upon, because sports is often, as Dr. Harry Edwards, the great sports sociologist, said, he said, sports is the canary in the coal mine. So if you start seeing these athletes getting kicked out of their jobs or getting silenced, getting squelched, you better believe that's happening in the broader society as well. And so that's why it's so important that we tune into what's happening in sports, because they can be this cultural marker of where we are as a society. And certainly after 2020, with that incredibly bizarre year in the world of sports, where the sports establishment felt like it had to reflect the reckoning on racism and police brutality in our society, and often did so in hyper-commercialistic, very bizarre ways. And at the same time, the fact that athletes felt like they could really speak in 2020 and had an unprecedented amount of power to do so, largely because they were keeping the lights on of the sports world by being willing to play in the context of having no fans and all the rest of it. But now in 2021, it's a different set of circumstances. I just spoke to a Major League Baseball player, and he was just telling me, we were talking just personally one-on-one, and he was just telling me about how different the locker room is this year than last year. And how last year it felt like, 1,000 roses were blooming in terms of discussions about what was happening in the world. And this year he feels incredibly marginalized, like he can't say a thing, and he didn't know what to do about that. He's like, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I literally talked to him as if I was talking, Toni would appreciate this. I was talking to him much more as an organizer than as like a friend or as a sports writer, thinking like, okay, well, who are the one or two people you can talk to? Can you build a core of people around them? Like real organizing 101 stuff, because he was just, hitting a brick wall when it came to trying to talk to the team.
Well, it also tells you something else there too, which was the things we talked about last year, which is, as much as you want to call it a reckoning or whatever else you want to, whatever other terms you want to use, my question had always been, how long is this going to last? Mm-hmm. And once it gets outlasted, do we go back? What is the new starting point? And I think that the athletes are in such an interesting place right now, because they did what was asked of them in so many ways. Mm-hmm. People said, oh, well, they shouldn't play. Well, last year after Jacob Blake got shot, they didn't play. Then they said, oh, they got to go out and do things. So then they went out and they started the voting registration things. And if you look at what the Wnba said, it can't be underestimated enough or understated. It can't be stated enough how much the Wnba really got involved in the Georgia Senate race last year, that the women have been far more impressive than the men over the last 75 years in terms of these issues in a very, very short period of time. And that, what do you do if you're the athlete who last year thought that there was going to be some form of reckoning? And then you see the very people who 20 years ago, well, not even 5 years ago with Kaepernick, who were calling you unpatriotic for taking a knee, and who were telling you to, they were telling you that you weren't American. They were saying all of these different things that we've been talking about. And so much of that element did what it did on January 6th. The players got slapped in the face. They got punched in the face in a lot of ways, because they were told all last summer, also by our former president, Barack Obama, to lean into the democratic principles, to do the right thing, to go back to work and to go play. And they did all of those things. And I'm really interested in seeing if the attitude now is, well, we did our part and now look, or if they're going to dig in even more the way competitors do and say, okay, now you want to see what we're capable of. We're going to lean in and fight even harder to the things that we believe in. They're in a really interesting place right now, because they did what was asked of them, and then they saw what happened on January 6th. And most of those people were the very ones saying that they were the un-Americans, that they were the non-patriots, to quote, paraphrase Paul Robeson.
Howard, you mentioned.
Sorry, David.
I was going to go to Toni, but I'll
okay. We're in an interesting place, because thinking about athletes and the rest of us, and what we do right now, we are in a position where we need to go beyond what our rights currently permit us to do, in order to protect the rights that we even are told we have. And we are also in a space where, this is not new. I'm thinking back to my own protest, that people often defined patriotism as forfeiting your rights, as being willing to not utilize your rights, right? So you are patriotic if you do not dissent. You are patriotic if you conform and comply. And we're seeing that and we're seeing that now. And at the same time, you are being patriotic if you allow systems of power to flout the law, to go beyond what the law permits them to do. And as we know, once you are forfeiting your rights, it's really hard to claw them back. And so I'm really terrified about the moment that we're in terms of the power of the police, in terms of the surveillance state that has been built over the last 20 years. And so looking at athletes and other folks with these really big platforms, not only is there a call to protect the rights, protect the right to vote and go out and really stand for the rights that we have, but that's going to call for tactics and actions that go beyond what is permitted.
Howard, you mentioned the WNBA, and I'm fascinated by that. I mean, by far the bravest and most outspoken athletes have been women, in the WNBA and in U.S. soccer and elsewhere. And this is a naive question, but why is that?
I think the biggest reason is, of course, one, you've got two different struggles. I think that the first thing is that women have been fighting just to get on the field, just to be recognized, so they understand. I think there's more of a camaraderie there, where I think that when you go back and look at the history of sports, of team sports with the men were far more rooted in white players, the white male players, believing, obviously because they had for half a century, that they believed that this was already theirs. Right. And so what they were doing was that they were accommodating black players. We were letting you play. We broke the color line. So you were being accepted into this. So it wasn't a shared experience. I think that the WNBA, there was much more of a shared experience. And of course, the other reason why there's a shared experience too, and in fact, I remember Toni, I think, brought up, or we were talking about this earlier, about this is not just the anniversary of 9/11, but also the 10th anniversary of Occupy. So you have this. You've got, on the one hand, the money. The women don't make the same money that the men make. They're looking at this, and they probably see far more opportunities, because I'm sure they feel like they have less to lose. They're trying to build a league. If the women were making $300-400 million contracts, maybe it would be a different dynamic as well. But when the average salaries out there, when you've got U.S. women's, when you hit the soccer team making less than the men, far less than men, 3-4 times less than what the men are making, and they're 50 times more successful, that creates an activist attitude inside on the class side, as opposed to the racial side.
Do you agree with that, Toni?
Yeah, I do. I was thinking back the last 10 years since Occupy. It's incredible. It's been 10 years. I remember bringing my very young kids there, and now my oldest is in 11th grade. And so thinking about the Kaepernick effect, thinking about professional athletes who are really in the prime of their career now and at the highest levels of income earning for their profession. 10 years ago, maybe they didn't have to make the choice between which side of the economic justice movement they were going to be on, right? They didn't have to navigate that piece. Maybe 10 years later, now that you are a millionaire, that is a piece of this movement that young people don't yet have to navigate, and there's still a crossroads. So I think it's just interesting to think about where it could go in the next 10 years. It's interesting to think about that with regard to women's sports, where the money will go in women's sports. It's interesting to think about young people today who are really in the struggle for wealth redistribution, economic justice. Will they be given a pathway? Will they be offered the money to absorb them into the power class, or will they hold firm to the struggle that they're currently in now?
Well, and we see that with Renee Montgomery of the Atlanta Dream getting a piece of the dream. She's an owner now. So once again, that those opportunities are going to. I don't know how big those opportunities are going to be, but they are absolutely going to be there as well.
They are tempting.
Dave, many of your Kaepernick effect people were women.
Yeah. That was my only that was the only thing I wanted to make sure in the book in terms of the folks I talked, because I just threw the doors open. Yeah. I was like, hey, anybody who wants to talk to me, you took a knee, I want to talk to you. And then I just collected all these stories and then winnowed them down. And the one thing I wanted to make sure was that there was some balance of men and women, partly because women get written out of history all the time. And women were so central to the young athletes, particularly in high school and college, who step forward. I spoke to multiple cheerleaders in the book, and oftentimes their motivation for taking a knee was because the football team wasn't, and they felt that the movement had to be represented where they were, and that part of the story needed to be told. And also, it's very fitting because women have also been the backbone of the Black Lives Matter movement from its inception. And so it's not surprising we would see that reflected in the world of sports.
So everyone who wrote a question will get a signed copy of, Dave will sign a copy, and
Sure.
and Howard won't be able to sign them because he's not here, but there's a couple of wonderful full dissidence essays here too.
Can I ask one question before you ask?
I'm going to ask one last question.
No, I would ask if someone could take a photo
Oh,
and then send it to me, because I don't know if Howard and Toni even know this, but you're like over our heads on this massive
am?
screen.
oh,
We
you're
are?
looming.
Did you
Yeah,
know that? I mean,
where you
this is
should, yes.
this is wild. It's like the 1984 Super Bowl commercial. Someone's going to throw a big wrench through the screen or something.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but thank you so. I want a picture to put on socials so y'all can see
Okay.
your mighty presence.
So this is a variation of one question someone asked, but I'm going to start it out by saying, I love sports, even for all of its flaws and contradictions. And Dave, you must too, because that's what you're devoting your life to, and Howard, obviously. And by the way, Howard's next book is going to be about Rickey Henderson. I can't wait to read that one. One of a kind. And Toni, you played sports, and it helped shape your life. So the question from someone is, for all of its limitations, isn't sports a positive model for inclusion and diversity? And why do each of you love sports?
Toni, go.
Is the question why sports? Is that essentially?
The question
I guess
is,
the end of it.
yeah, I mean, is sports a model for diversity and inclusion? That's part of the question. The other part is, why do we love sports, despite all of its flaws?
I really think that's the question of the moment, right? I mean, I think especially in the past few years, there's been an expanded and heightened conversation around the purpose of sports, and one that I think is great and necessary. But, sports can be winner takes all, or sports can be, there's an opportunity here for everyone. There's a value in playing. There's something that you get out of being with people, out of seeing what your body is capable of working your mind in that way. And I would choose that pathway for sports. I think sports is so instrumental, so important in our culture. It's at the core of our culture. And so you have to utilize it. You have to make it into something that is going to advance some model of democracy and justice and inclusion, because the culture is going to mimic that. So I really think there's no other option except to do that. And it's absolutely possible to create a paradigm of sports where everybody gets a chance to participate. There are no rules that say it needs to be binary. There are no rules that say that we need to construct this reality where it only matters if you get first place. That is not the truth. That is not absolute. We can absolutely create something different, and we can be.
Yeah, no, I love sports because it's fun. I love the competition. I love the game. I love all of it. I mean, the thing about the game that just, it just starts so early. I mean, I've been playing sports since I can remember, and watching sports since I can remember, and all of it. There are all these different things that it's such a great broad question. You can talk about it from your identity. You can talk about it from your regional identity. You can talk about it from your personality, your need to compete, your need to win, your hatred of losing, or whatever, or your comfort with losing, whatever it is, right? It's all of it. That's very, very, very different from the business of sports. Yep. None of that has anything to do with the business of sports. The business of sports is not, and I repeat, is not an inherently positive experience. Mm-hmm. It's a business. The playing of sports is phenomenal. The having sports in your world is phenomenal. I play tennis as much as I watch it. And so there are all of those things. And I think that the real question here, when it comes to, and as a parent especially, my child doesn't play sports. And one of the reasons he doesn't play sports is because of my fear of sports. I didn't know how much I could handle some asshole adult yelling at my child. Mm-hmm. I was like, do I really want to see that? That's also a part of sports. And so he also got hit in the face with a baseball and didn't put his glove up, and that pretty much scarred him too. I was like, dude, that's what the glove is for. Use it to catch the ball, not with your face. But anyway, I mean, I think that the real issue with sports is making sure that we understand the distinction between the game itself, which is, as Toni said, what you make it, and the business of sports, which includes political action committees and race and politics and labor and all of those things. And when you conflate the two, you run into problems. If you're able to separate the two and look at it a bit more objectively, then maybe it's possible to understand why some of these things are happening at a multi-billion-dollar level. We throw this stuff into the business in language. The language is one of the biggest issues we have. You get paid all that money to play a kid's game. It's not a kid's game. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that people are fighting over because it has so much influence in the culture.
Dave, we could go on all day, but we can't. So I'd like an answer, but keep it short.
Very short. Just that I coach my son's rec league basketball team, and it's awesome. And I just wish that was everybody's experience, but it's not.
Yes, great. Well, I can't thank you three enough. I mean, it's an incredible group.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
As I said, the people who asked the questions, even if I didn't get to them, you get a signed copy of The Kaepernick Effect and of Howard's Full Dissidence. So thank you all. And I wish you both could be here, but it was great seeing you up on that huge screen. Take care.
Thank you so much, David.
See you guys.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.